The phone call came like a punch. "Mom, you're just taking up space in my home." Still, I don't react, fingers tightening around the old family photo. As the weight of her words settles, the familiar smell of her childhood perfume lingers in the air. While I stare at the picture, it hits me. This wasn't about space. It was about erasure. The same way she's tried to erase me from her life. That's when I decided, if she thinks I take up too much space, she'll never take a single line in my estate. Before we begin, may I ask, where in this big, beautiful world are you listening from? It's always a quiet honor to know who's sharing this space. Drop it in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe. Janice's hand froze above the worn notebook, the one she kept beside her in the living room for moments like this. When the world outside felt loud and the silence within pressed too heavily, she'd been sitting on the old armchair near the front window, the one that had been hers for years. She wasn't quite sure how long she'd been listening. It could have been minutes or hours. Time had a way of folding when you weren't looking. Through the open door to the kitchen, she saw Melanie on the video call. The soothing, faux perky tone floated out like a thick perfume. "I can't film with her here. She takes up space." Janice's breath hitched for a second, but she didn't move. She didn't make a sound. The words, cutting in their simplicity, were nothing new. Melanie had said things like this before. Quiet insults. Things that only made sense in Melanie's world of energetic flow and balanced vibes. But this felt like a final verdict. Like a judge had declared her existence a nuisance. Her heart thudded once, then twice. She closed the notebook and stood slowly, the creaking of the chair beneath her far too loud in the sudden silence of the room. Upstairs, she walked to the guest room, or, as she had come to think of it, her assigned corner. A place neither hers nor anyone else's, but simply a holding cell for someone waiting to be invisible. She stepped inside, the soft carpet underfoot offering no comfort. The room felt smaller every day, its walls closing in. When she glanced back down the stairs, she saw Trevor, avoiding her eyes as he always did. He'd learned, somewhere along the way, that silence could be safer than speaking. He wasn't brave enough to question Melanie, not anymore. But he also couldn't look at Janice without seeing the reminder of what his life had become. Callie was different. Callie noticed everything. She had a gift for seeing people, even when they weren't trying to be seen. As Janice walked past, Callie caught her eye. There was nothing but quiet understanding in her gaze. The kind of understanding that left a lump in Janice's throat. She didn't want to be seen that way. Not now. Not when she was fighting so hard to keep it together. That night, the house felt emptier than usual. Melanie's coaching group filled the living room with voices, shrill and enthusiastic, all designed to sound positive. But Janice had lived long enough to know when it was all just noise. She could hear Melanie's exaggerated laughter through the door, the hum of her brand growing louder by the minute. Janice didn't want to be part of it. She sat at the small dining table, the plate of food growing cold in front of her, alone. The irony was not lost on her. The walls of this house, once filled with so much hope and love, now seemed to swallow her whole. Janice's thoughts drifted to the day she'd first stepped into this house, arms full of plans and optimism, ready to build a life with her daughter. But somewhere along the way, it had all shifted. The vision Melanie had once shared with her had narrowed into something smaller, more curated, more controlled. The callousness in Melanie's voice echoed in her ears. "She takes up space." Janice's pen scratched across the page of her planner. A small note, a simple declaration. Note, I am not clutter. I am history. The words felt like armor, but she wasn't sure they would protect her. Downstairs, Melanie's laughter continued to ring out. Janice heard the others' voices, high-pitched and unbothered, praising one another for their personal growth, their journey. All while Janice's own journey had been erased, piece by piece, from the house she'd once called home. Her pen hovered over the paper for a moment longer. Maybe it was a sign, not of defeat, but of something she'd known deep down for a long time. Her space here was always conditional. She wasn't allowed to take up too much. Not too loud, not too real, not too anything. But she wasn't going to shrink anymore. Not for them, not for anyone. The door to the living room opened a fraction, and Janice could hear Melanie's voice, sweet but sharp. "Ladies, let's take a break. I'll be right back to check in with you all." The house went quiet, save for the faint clink of glass and the distant hum of a refrigerator. But in that stillness, Janice's resolve hardened. She stood and walked to the window, staring out at the cold mountain peaks. The air felt crisp, the city below blinking in the early evening light. And in that moment, she realized that she had nothing left to prove. Tomorrow she would begin taking back what was hers, a little at a time. It's time to make space of my own. She could hear Melanie's voice in the back of her mind, telling her she didn't belong here. But that was the thing, wasn't it? It wasn't Melanie's house, not anymore. It was hers, in every way that counted. The house was too quiet, the air still as Janice sat at the old desk, tracing her finger over the words on her will. Her original will, the one where Melanie was named sole heir. "I leave all my worldly possessions to Melanie Abbott Gray, my daughter, to be divided as she deems appropriate." The ink was dark, clean, formal. All the things Janice had believed she needed at the time. It had seemed simple then. The kind of peace-of-mind document that everyone wrote, just in case. She'd been so sure that Melanie would carry on her legacy, that the house would stay in their family, that she could rest knowing her daughter would take care of things. But now, as Janice read those words, they felt hollow. "We'll make it all streamlined later," Melanie's voice echoed in her head. The soft, insistent tones of a woman who thought she could sort everything, including people, into neat boxes. Melanie didn't care about legacy. She cared about control. Janice set the will down with a quiet sigh and picked up her phone. She knew what needed to be done. It wasn't just about possessions. It was about reclaiming what was hers, her history, her voice, her space. The people who had been trimming her away like overgrown ivy had to be cut back. She dialed Gloria's number. The line rang twice before her old friend picked up, her voice always steady and blunt. "I think it's time I downsize," Janice said, feeling a strange sense of calm wash over her. "Downsize, on people." Gloria's response was instant, unwavering. "Then cut where the overgrowth is." Janice didn't need to hear anything else. She'd made her decision. The next day, she sat across from Richard Fan at his quiet, immaculate office downtown. The windows looked out over the street, but it was the silence inside that mattered. Richard had always been careful with high-conflict estates, especially when the family dynamic was as volatile as Janice's. "I've made some changes," Janice said, passing over the documents. Richard glanced over them and nodded, his face impassive. "We'll need to remove Melanie entirely then," Richard said, pulling out a new sheet of paper and sliding it toward her. His voice was calm, almost neutral, but there was a flicker of approval in his eyes. He didn't have to say it. He understood what this meant. Janice picked up the pen, her fingers cold against the smooth surface. She hesitated only for a moment. The decision had been a long time coming. She signed her name with purpose. There was no going back now. Richard looked up as she finished. "This will be done quietly. No public notices, no battles. You'll be free of her." Janice nodded, her gaze steady. "I want it clean. I want it final." The thought of Melanie finding out, of her reaction, almost made Janice smile. She could already hear the disbelief, the anger. But she didn't care. This was her choice. She had waited long enough for her life to be hers again. Later that evening, as Janice sat at her kitchen table, a ping from her phone broke the silence. It was a message from Callie. I heard what she said. "I'm sorry." Janice stared at the words for a long moment. She didn't need Callie to apologize. She knew that her granddaughter was caught between loyalty and something much deeper. She typed a reply slowly. "I'm proud of you. You're not like her." She set the phone down with a small sigh. The air felt lighter. There was a space now between her and everything Melanie had tried to claim. The house, the history, the narrative. Tomorrow she would start moving forward. And for the first time in a long time, she felt certain that whatever came next, it would be hers to decide. It was late afternoon when Melanie's voice pierced the quiet of the house, her tone so carefully calibrated to sound reasonable. "Mom, I think it's probably time we start looking into retirement communities," she said, as though she were suggesting a pleasant day trip. "You'll have your own space again." Your energy is heavy here. Janice paused in the hallway, her fingers gripping the doorframe. She didn't speak right away. The words took a moment to settle, the weight of them pressing down like a hand on her chest. Heavy here, she repeated in her mind. She had always been heavy to Melanie, her presence a burden, an inconvenience. The irony of her daughter suggesting it was time for her to go was not lost on Janice. She'd been waiting for this moment. The polite, clinical dismissal that Melanie would dress up in the same way she wrapped everything else, in the illusion of concern. "I'm fine here, Melanie," Janice said, her voice smooth, but tinged with a coolness she'd worked hard to cultivate. Melanie nodded, an empty smile curling on her lips. "I just want you to be happy, Mom. And if you're not happy here, that's okay. It's just the vibe." Janice smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. She had heard all the excuses before. The talk of vibes, energetic flows, and how everything in Melanie's world revolved around feeling good, looking good, staying untangled. There was nothing in Melanie's words that resembled care. It was always about making things easy for herself, making the space clear for her next thing, her next project. "Thank you for your concern," Janice said, offering a thin, practiced smile. It was a courtesy, nothing more. Melanie wouldn't hear the unspoken words, wouldn't feel the cutting silence behind them. Once the door closed behind her daughter, Janice stood still for a moment, letting the weight of Melanie's suggestion sink in. She wasn't just asking Janice to leave the house. She was asking her to leave her life. The memory of her original will came rushing back. Melanie as sole heir, a promise made in the naive days before all the erosion began. The thought of Melanie's complete control over everything she had worked for, everything she had built, made Janice's skin crawl. No, she wasn't going to let it happen. It was time for the final break. Janice had already made her decision, but now it was time to formalize it. She picked up her phone and dialed Richard Fawn's office without a second thought. His calm, professional voice answered on the second ring. "Janice," he said, his tone cool but welcoming, as if he had been waiting for her call. "What can I do for you?" "I need to make a change," she said simply. "I want to revoke the current will. I want to make sure Melanie has no claim on anything I own." There was no hesitation in Richard's response, only the faintest of pauses. He understood. "I'll prepare the new documents. Are there any other changes you'd like to make?" "Yes. I want to add Callie, and I want the local preservation trust to be included. I want the house to support something that matters, something that will last. And Melanie, she's not to be mentioned anywhere, not now, not ever." Richard's voice was calm, but there was a small note of approval that slipped through. "Understood. I'll add a no-contact clause too. If she challenges this, she forfeits everything." Janice felt a quiet satisfaction ripple through her, even though her heart ached. She wasn't doing this out of malice. This was about reclaiming her life, making sure the final chapter of her story wasn't written by someone else. When the call ended, Janice sat for a long time at the kitchen table, staring out at the yard. The late afternoon sun cast a warm glow over the garden, the one she had tended to for years, planting seeds that had grown into something tangible, something real. It felt like the last link she had to the person she once was, before everything had shifted. She picked up her pen, an old fountain pen that had belonged to her husband. It still worked perfectly. The ink flowed smoothly across the page as she began to write the changes in her own hand. Careful, deliberate. Each word she wrote felt like a declaration, not of defiance, but of assertion. Of saying that her life and her legacy would belong to her and no one else. She paused, looking down at the line where she had written Callie's name. She hadn't told her granddaughter yet. Callie would understand, but she was still so young, so unsure of where her loyalties should lie. Janice couldn't help but feel a pang of regret, a regret for all the years that had been lost, for all the moments when her daughter had grown further and further away. The doorbell rang, breaking her thoughts. Janice set the pen down and stood, her heart quickening for no reason at all. She wasn't expecting anyone. As she opened the door, her breath caught in her throat. Callie stood there, her eyes wide, filled with concern. "I heard what happened," Callie said, her voice soft but steady. I came to see you. Janice's gaze softened. But she said nothing. She just stepped aside and let her granddaughter in, the air between them thick with unspoken things. Callie's eyes lingered on the papers on the table. I don't know what to say, Callie began, but Janice held up a hand, silencing her. You don't have to say anything, darling, Janice said quietly. But there are things you'll need to know, things I need to leave behind. Callie nodded slowly, her eyes brimming with something that looked like understanding of something much bigger than her mother. Janice felt a quiet, unshakable peace settle over her. This was the beginning of a new kind of future, a future where she was finally free. Janice was in the kitchen when it happened. She'd been moving around the counter, her hands steady as she wiped down the counters, lost in thought. The weight of the decision she had made earlier still hung in the air like an unspoken promise. She hadn't told Melanie yet, couldn't bear the confrontation. But it was coming. The will had been signed. She was cutting the last tether that bound her to a daughter who had stopped seeing her a long time ago. The mug slipped from the edge of the counter, a moment of carelessness. It crashed to the floor with a sound so sharp it felt like a warning. Janice bent down, her fingers skimming the ceramic shards. Trevor was there before she could reach them. He muttered something, an apology maybe, though she wasn't sure if he meant it. His hand hovered over the mess, but didn't quite touch it. I'm sorry, he said again, not quite looking her in the eye. Janice didn't respond at first. The mug had been hers for decades. One of the few things left that held any sentimental value. It had sat on the shelf next to her husband's favorite books, reminders of a life she had cherished, a life that felt as fragile as the pieces now scattered across the floor. She reached out slowly, the sound of the broken pieces echoing in the silence. There was nothing else to say, nothing left to do. She could see it, the way Trevor stepped back, his eyes avoiding the mess, almost as if he feared the pieces might have some kind of power over him. It's okay, she said finally, her voice flat, resigned. Melanie's voice cut through the quiet, as sharp as the shards that lay on the floor. You left it in the wrong spot. Janice's gaze flicked up to her daughter, standing in the doorway with her arms crossed, watching. Her tone was clinical, her words blaming, as if the broken mug were her fault, as if Janice were the one who had broken something that had mattered. The coldness was unmistakable, the same coldness that had been in her voice when she suggested that Janice find another place to live, the same coldness that cut through every conversation they'd had for years. Janice met her gaze. She could feel the weight of all those years, the years when Melanie had learned to treat her as nothing more than a nuisance, as clutter in a house that was no longer hers. You know, I've had that mug for almost 30 years, Janice said, her voice steady, but there was a hard edge to it now. It was a gift from your father. He bought it for me the year we moved into this house. Melanie didn't react. She just stood there, waiting for Janice to finish, as if this were some sort of chore that had to be dealt with before they could move on to something more important. Callie entered the room then, her eyes wide, taking in the scene, the broken mug, the distance between Janice and Melanie, the sharpness in the air. Without a word, she bent down beside Janice and started sweeping up the pieces. Janice watched her for a moment before turning back to Melanie. Callie didn't break it, she said quietly. I did. Melanie shrugged and walked away. It's just a mug. Just get rid of the mess, will you? Callie paused, her gaze lingering on Janice for a moment. She opened her mouth, hesitated, and then whispered, This isn't okay, Grandma. The words were so simple, yet they cut deeper than anything else that had been said all day. They felt like the truth, like the one thing that wasn't hidden behind excuses or veiled attempts to move on. The kind of truth that only someone who saw clearly could offer. Janice nodded, her heart heavy but somehow steadied by the quiet strength in Callie's voice. I know, she said softly. Later that week, Janice made a decision. She gathered what few items she had left, the heirlooms, the things that had once held meaning, and packed them up. The clock on the mantel, the old photo albums, the lamps that had lit up the rooms she used to fill with laughter. She took them all to the Historical Society downtown, the place she had been supporting for years, the place that was preserving the history of this city, of families like hers. She didn't want them to end up in Melanie's hands, not anymore, not after everything. The house was emptier now. The walls that had once held so many memories were stripped bare. One last thing remained, a single photo from the early days of her marriage, when the world had seemed full of promise and potential. She paused in front of it, her fingers hovering over the frame. It was a good photo, a picture of a time when life had been simpler, before everything became complicated. She hadn't realized how much she had needed that photo, how much it had kept her tethered to the past. But that was the point, wasn't it? She took it off the wall and set it aside, along with the rest. Gloria called her that evening. "You're not moving out, Janice," she said bluntly, her voice as steady as always. "You're moving on." Janice sat back in her chair, feeling the weight of those words settle inside her. Moving on. She had spent so many years waiting to be seen, waiting to be heard. But now, finally, she could see herself again. And she was ready to move on, to let go of everything that had held her down. Tomorrow, she would be someone new, and Melanie would never know what hit her. Janice sat quietly in the living room, watching as Melanie led a small group of friends through the house on a live video tour. Her voice was overly bright, the enthusiasm forced, as she panned the camera over the space. "We're manifesting multi-gen balance here, guys," Melanie said with a wide grin, her hands gesturing toward the open living area. "This is where we're creating harmony. It's about merging energies, blending generations. And it's ours. Ours." Janice's breath hitched, but she stayed still, her hands folded in her lap. The words stung, a reminder of everything that had been taken from her. The house, once shared between mother and daughter, had become Melanie's stage, her property, her narrative. Janice had once imagined a future here, growing old in the home she built. But that dream had dissolved, replaced by Melanie's glossy version of reality. Ours. The weight of those words hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. Janice could feel it, the erasure of everything she had been, everything she had contributed. It was all part of the illusion Melanie had crafted, and Janice was no longer even a ghost in the background. As the tour continued, Janice stood up quietly and walked to the hallway, leaving the noise of Melanie's words behind. She didn't need to watch this. She didn't need to bear witness to Melanie's self-serving brand of reality. By the time Melanie finished the video, Janice was already upstairs, packing the last of her belongings. 6 boxes. 6 boxes, and nothing more. Clothes, old papers, books she hadn't read in years. Everything was carefully folded, taped, and packed. The house, once brimming with life, now felt empty, its walls like hollow shells that reflected nothing of her anymore. She took her time with the last box, lingering on the small details, the items that used to mean something. The silver photo frame, the old clock on the mantel, the lamp she had bought with her first paycheck. They were all just things now, pieces of a life she was walking away from. When the last box was taped shut, Janice stood in the doorway, looking over the room one last time. The space felt different now, colder, emptier. It was no longer a home, not for her, not anymore. She called Gloria. "I'm ready," she said, the words simple but final. "I'll be there in an hour," Gloria replied, no questions asked, her voice warm with understanding. Janice hung up the phone and walked to the window. The light outside was soft, the kind that only came at the end of the day. She watched the sun dip behind the mountains, a small flicker of peace settling in her chest. She was leaving, but more importantly, she was reclaiming herself. Gloria arrived shortly after, and without a word, they got to work. The few boxes Janice had left were loaded into the car, and they drove across town to her new place, a small, simple artist co-op that already felt more like home than the house she had just left. It was nothing extravagant, but it was hers. It was a space where she could breathe, where she could exist without being erased or minimized. Gloria helped her unload the boxes, arranging them carefully in the new apartment. Books on the shelf, a chair by the window, a place for everything. It felt good, grounding, steady. For the first time in years, Janice didn't feel like she was living in someone else's shadow. Later that evening, as she sat down on the couch, a ping from her phone broke the silence. Melanie had sent a voice note. "I hope this isn't personal," the message began. "Too casual, too light. But we're going to need to have a conversation about the house. I'll be around tomorrow to discuss. Let me know when you're free. Janice stared at the screen. She played the message again, a small chuckle escaping her lips. The words didn't land. Melanie had no idea. She didn't know what Janice had already done, how the course of everything had shifted. Janice put her phone down and leaned back, a small smile on her face. Tomorrow, Melanie would come. But it wouldn't be the conversation Melanie expected. Not anymore. For the first time in years, Janice felt the air around her expand, full of new possibilities, full of choices. Tomorrow, she was moving forward. And there was nothing Melanie could do to stop it. Janice stood in the center of her new apartment, taking in the stillness. The walls were bare for now, the furniture sparse, but the space felt more like home than any place she'd been in years. The light from the large windows poured in, casting soft beams across the hardwood floors. It wasn't large, but it was hers, truly hers. And that made all the difference. She had filled the room with the things that mattered to her. Old maps she had once used in her city planning work, worn books that had lived on her shelf for decades, and photographs of places she had visited alone or with people who had once meant something. She had been careful about what she unpacked, choosing only what spoke to her soul, what felt like her. The soft light from the desk lamp fell across the floor, making shadows stretch long into the corners of the room. The lamp had been her husband's, the one thing she'd refused to leave behind. It had always felt like home. She placed it on the table by the window, and as the light flickered, she felt it. A deep sense of peace she hadn't realized she had been missing. It wasn't just the space that had changed, it was her. For the first time in years, Janice didn't feel small. She didn't feel like she had to shrink to fit into someone else's version of life. This was her space, not just physically, but emotionally, spiritually. She was ready to breathe in a way she hadn't been able to in far too long. The doorbell rang, pulling Janice out of her thoughts. She wasn't expecting anyone, but when she opened the door, she found Callie standing there, holding a bag of takeout and looking uncertain. "I brought dinner," Callie said quietly, her eyes searching Janice's face, as though waiting for a sign that she was welcome. Janice stepped aside, feeling a small, unexpected lump form in her throat. "Come in, I'd love that." They sat together at the small kitchen table, eating the food Callie had brought, and for the first time in a long time, Janice didn't feel like she was enduring someone else's presence. She wasn't walking on eggshells, trying to fit into a role. This felt real. Callie picked at her food, her gaze downcast. After a long moment, she spoke again, her voice soft but steady. "I miss you being around," Callie said, "but not the way they were around you." Janice's heart squeezed at the words. She had spent so many years pretending everything was fine, hiding behind her own quiet suffering, while Melanie and Trevor created a version of their family that was half real, half pretend. Callie's honesty felt like a release. She wasn't asking Janice to be anyone else. She wasn't asking for Janice to become the person Melanie had wanted her to be. Janice reached across the table, resting her hand over Callie's. "I'm here now, and I'm not going anywhere," she said, her voice quiet but resolute. Callie nodded, her eyes filled with understanding. There was no need for more words. The bond between them was unspoken, but real. That evening, after dinner, Janice sat down at her desk, the will and trust documents in front of her. Richard had sent them, finalized, and ready for her signature. She felt a strange mix of relief and sorrow as she looked over the papers. But this was the next step. She had already made the decision. Melanie would no longer have any claim on the house. There would be no inheritance, no more pieces of Janice's life to manipulate. The only condition she had left was simple. The estate would support affordable housing initiatives. She had worked as a city planner, spent her career ensuring that the underprivileged had a place to live. She wanted her legacy to carry that forward. Something real, something that would last. Janice signed the documents with a steady hand. It felt final. It felt right. And for the first time in a long time, she felt that she was taking ownership of her past, her present, and her future. As she signed the last line, her phone pinged. Melanie had sent her a gift, a small wrapped box. Janice opened it to find a candle, lavender and eucalyptus, with a tag that read, "Lighten Up." The irony wasn't lost on her. Melanie had always been so careful with her passive-aggressive gestures, always hiding behind the pretense of care. Janice smiled softly to herself, placing the candle on the windowsill where the sunlight would catch it in the morning. It would stay there, untouched. A reminder. She didn't need Melanie's gestures to know who she was anymore. Tomorrow would bring its challenges, but for now, Janice leaned back in her chair and let the quiet fill her. She had reclaimed the space she needed, and she was no longer bound by anyone else's rules. Tomorrow she would move forward, and nothing could take that from her. Janice stood in the doorway of the shelter, the soft hum of the building surrounding her. It was small, modest, but there was life here. People coming and going, conversations, laughter. The kind of noise she hadn't realized she missed until now. She looked around at the shelves and tables, her heart lifting as she saw the items she had donated. Her old linens, kitchenware, even some of the furniture, all neatly arranged and being put to use. There were no labels or grand gestures, no thank you plaques, just people. People who needed these things, and now had them. She walked deeper into the room, her hand brushing across a small shelf where some of her dishes were stacked. They didn't look out of place, they just belonged here. A woman in her 30s, wearing a faded sweater, smiled at Janice as she picked up one of the plates. "These are beautiful," she said softly. "Thank you." Janice felt something stir in her chest, a mix of sadness and gratitude. This was the legacy I should have left, she thought. Not the house, not the material things she'd fought so hard to hold on to for years. These moments, this quiet contribution to someone's life. She stood there for a moment longer, just watching, as the woman carried the plates away. Then Janice spotted it. The old quilt, the one that had been in her family for generations. Her grandmother's work, meticulously stitched and worn with age. It had always been a treasure to Janice, a reminder of where she came from. But she had left it with the other items. There was no room for it in her new apartment, and she realized something as she stared at it folded neatly on a nearby shelf. Someone should be warm, she smiled softly, her fingers brushing the edges of the quilt. It wasn't hers to keep anymore. It was time for someone else to hold it, to wrap themselves in the warmth that had been passed down through the years. It was a quiet letting go, one she wasn't sure she was ready for, but needed. Later that week, Janice was in the kitchen, sitting with Callie over coffee when Callie dropped the news. "I heard from Melanie," she said, her voice hesitant. Janice's eyes flickered up, but she didn't react. "What about?" "She's planning to remodel your old room," Callie said, as if testing the waters. "She wants to turn it into a content studio, for her business stuff." Janice paused, the quietest laugh escaping her lips. The idea of Melanie reimagining her old room into a content studio felt like the final step in erasing any trace of her from the house. That room, once full of so many possibilities, of their shared memories, their life together, was now to be commodified, repurposed for yet another brand. But Janice wasn't angry, not anymore. "Good," Janice said quietly, her voice measured. It was never a room for love. Callie looked at her, her brow furrowed. But Janice's calmness seemed to settle her. It wasn't the first time Janice had let go of something that once felt sacred. There was no room for that kind of sentiment anymore, not when it had been so easily discarded by those who didn't understand its worth. The next day, Janice received a text from Trevor. It was awkward, as most of his communication had been since everything changed, but it was sincere enough. "Thank you for being understanding," the message read. "It's hard, but I appreciate it." Janice read the message but didn't reply right away. She thought about it for a moment, then deleted it. She didn't need his gratitude. She didn't need his acknowledgement. It was too little, too late. There was a knock at the door later that evening. Gloria stood in the doorway, holding a bottle of wine in one hand, a glass in the other. "To the art of exiting while standing tall," Gloria said with a grin, her eyes bright with that unspoken understanding they'd shared all these years. Gloria had seen it, how Janice had been bent but never broken. Janice took the wine with a smile, feeling the weight of it all settle into her bones. For so long, she had been standing in someone else's shadow, but now she was standing on her own, stronger than she had ever been. They sat together in the quiet of Janice's new apartment, the light from the small lamp casting a soft glow over the room. There was no need for more words. They simply sat, and Janice realized something. She had reclaimed not just the space around her, but the parts of herself that had been lost for so long. She wasn't invisible anymore. She had taken back what was hers, and nothing, not Melanie's passive-aggressive candles, not Trevor's hollow thanks, could change that. Janice sat at her kitchen table, the soft light of the afternoon casting a warm glow over her new space. She'd been making progress, reclaiming her life, piece by piece. There was nothing left to haunt her in the silence anymore, but then, as she picked up her phone, something stopped her in her tracks. It was an email alert, a subject line that she almost ignored. "You've been quoted." Curiosity got the better of her, and Janice opened the message. Her eyes skimmed the words, then froze. She was quoted on Melanie's coaching website, under a section titled Client Testimonials. Janice's name appeared in bold letters. "She taught me how to let go." Janice A. Janice blinked, the words blurring for a moment. Her stomach churned. Taught me how to let go? She had never said that. Never once. And certainly not in the way Melanie was implying. The message felt like a physical punch. Melanie had taken Janice's name, twisted it, and used it as part of her brand. A hollow echo of the lessons Janice had fought so hard to impart. It was another attempt to control the narrative, to erase Janice from her own story. Janice's fingers shook as she held the phone, reading the quote again. Her mouth went dry. This wasn't just a misquote, this was manipulation. An attempt to turn Janice into a figurehead for Melanie's image of self-help and letting go. Her heart hammered in her chest. A wave of anger and betrayal washed over her. She could feel the weight of everything. The years of being erased. Of being diminished to a footnote in Melanie's carefully curated life. And now, this. This was the last straw. Without thinking twice, Janice screenshot the page. She didn't need to think about it. She didn't need to check her emotions. She just acted. She fired off an email to Richard Fan, her lawyer, her fingers flying across the keys. "Richard," the email began, "I'm sure you saw this already, but I need you to take action on this. Is defamation still a thing?" She attached the screenshot, hit send, and sat back in her chair. The rage didn't dissipate, but she could feel a different kind of clarity settle over her. She wasn't going to let this slide. Not this time. Minutes later, Richard's response popped up. His tone was calm, but firm. "I'll send a formal takedown notice immediately. Don't worry, Janice. This will be handled." Janice leaned back in her chair, the anger still smoldering, but the certainty of her decision calming her. The power had shifted. Melanie could try to control the story, but she couldn't erase Janice anymore. Within 24 hours, the quote vanished from the website. Janice checked. It was gone. And the email from Richard, confirming the successful takedown, brought her a sense of quiet satisfaction. But there was still something unsettled in the air, something unspoken. Later that evening, as Janice was cleaning up after dinner, her phone pinged again. She checked the message. It was from Callie. "I heard about the quote. I'm so sorry, Grandma," Callie wrote, her words tentative. "I wish I could say something without starting a war." Janice smiled softly at the screen. She understood. Callie had always been caught between two worlds, between her mother's brand of peace and the truth of what was happening to Janice. But Janice wasn't angry with her. She never was. "Callie," she typed slowly, "you're saying something just by seeing me." It was all Janice needed, just to be seen. She set her phone down, and for the first time, she felt the tightness in her chest ease. Callie had been on her side all along. Melanie could try to rewrite history, but it didn't matter. Janice had her own truth now, and she wasn't going to let anyone, not even her own daughter, twist it. The next morning, Janice received a voice message from Melanie. The words were dripping with that familiar insincerity. "Was that really necessary, Mom?" Melanie asked, her tone syrupy and passive-aggressive. "All you had to do was ask." "But I guess we're just not on the same page, huh?" Janice listened to the message once, then again. Each word felt like it chipped away at something deep inside her, but she didn't respond. She didn't need to. Melanie had finally shown her true colors, and Janice had already made her choice. With a small smile, Janice deleted the message. There was no need to keep it. Melanie was trying to hold on to the last scraps of control, but Janice wasn't playing that game anymore. As she sat in the quiet of her new apartment, the weight of the past few days lifting from her, Janice knew one thing for sure. She had won, not in a battle of words or wills, but in the quiet, steadfast reclaiming of her own life. She didn't need Melanie's approval or her twisted versions of the past. Janice had her own future to write, and nothing, not even a passive-aggressive message, could take that from her. Melanie's voice echoed through Janice's mind, as it always did when she tried to deny the truth. "My mother always supported my path," she had said at the retreat, her words sweet and smooth, designed to fit neatly into the glossy version of her life. The camera focused on Melanie, her carefully curated image of a spiritual guru with wisdom to share. Janice had heard about the retreat through Callie, who mentioned it casually one evening over dinner. "I heard her talk about you, Grandma, on her stage. She said you were the one who supported her from the start." Callie's voice had faltered slightly, unsure of how to navigate the delicate balance between truth and the act her mother had put on. Janice had smiled, the same practiced smile she had used for years. It wasn't about being seen, it was about letting go. But this was different. The narrative Melanie was spinning couldn't be allowed to stand unchallenged. Afterward, Janice received an email from a retreat guest. The message was simple. "You must be proud of your daughter's success. She's come a long way, and it seems you were such a big part of that." Janice read the email twice, the weight of the words pressing down on her chest. She didn't feel proud of Melanie, not anymore. Pride, in this context, felt like an empty word. It was the support of silence, of absence, of compliance. All the things Janice had refused to give her daughter for so long. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard, the reply coming to her with painful clarity. Support isn't silence, and legacy isn't performative. She hit send. The next day, the reply spread like wildfire through elder advocacy circles. The simple, concise response was shared, not just for its truth, but for the quiet power in Janice's refusal to be erased. The words were out there now, no longer hidden in the spaces between mother and daughter, no longer part of Melanie's carefully curated narrative. Soon Janice found herself invited to speak, not on stage with Melanie, but in a far quieter, more significant way. It wasn't the spotlight she had ever sought. She had always believed that the most meaningful conversations happened offstage, in the small, subtle acts of defiance and care. But the invitations kept coming, more each day, from organizations dedicated to elder rights and advocacy. Janice thought about it. She thought about standing in front of people, sharing her story, her truth. But no, that wasn't the path for her anymore. Instead, Janice donated to fund a lecture series in her name, a series focused on the importance of visibility and dignity for the elderly. The small, quiet work she had always done in the background was now given a platform, but not for her, for the voices who had been silenced far too long. It was the kind of legacy she wanted to leave behind, not for recognition, but for change, for something that mattered. As the lecture series began to take shape, Janice settled back into the quiet of her own life, her days filled with small tasks, purposeful actions. She had never been the type to chase after the spotlight. A few weeks later, Callie came to visit, sitting beside Janice on the small couch. In her hand was an envelope, an official-looking one. "It's from the lawyer," Callie said, her voice quiet but filled with something more. She handed it to Janice, who opened it carefully. Inside was a copy of Janice's final trust summary, signed and finalized. Callie's name appeared first, a small but significant change in the will. Beneath it, the words that hit Janice like a soft blow. "For the only one who noticed." Janice set the paper down, feeling something rise in her throat. She wasn't sure whether to smile or cry. Callie, her granddaughter, had been the one to see through the layers, the one who had never asked for anything but the truth. "That's all I ever wanted, Callie," Janice whispered, her voice hoarse. "To be seen." Callie hugged her, and Janice held her close, the weight of years finally lifting. She had done it. She had lived her truth, no longer hidden in the shadow of someone else's expectations. And the legacy she would leave behind, that would be hers, not Melanie's. The diagnosis came quietly, like the falling of a leaf, unnoticed until it had already settled deep. Pulmonary fibrosis. A word so soft and final, it didn't quite feel real when Janice first heard it. The doctor had explained it gently. Treatable, manageable, but not reversible. There was no cure, no magic solution. Time would stretch out before her, but the end would come, slowly and in its own time. Janice had listened, nodded, and thanked the doctor. There was no point in burdening anyone with panic. Not Melanie, certainly, not Trevor, who had drifted even further into a quiet disinterest. No, the weight of it was hers, to carry, quietly, privately. She didn't tell Melanie, not that day, not ever. There was no need to drag her daughter into this final chapter. Janice had long ago learned that the only way to navigate the space between them was to keep things simple, to keep them light. She didn't want to hear any more hollow reassurances, any more of Melanie's fake empathy, wrapped in carefully curated words. Instead, she told Richard, Gloria, and Callie, the three people who had stayed, who saw her, who understood what it meant to be a person, not just a mother, not just a role to be filled. Richard was practical, as always. He offered legal advice, helped her rework the living trust to ensure that her wishes would be honored. Melanie's name was nowhere to be found on it. Not a line, not a word. Everything was going to Callie, to Gloria, to the Preservation Trust. No more manipulation, no more rewriting of history. Gloria, ever the steadfast presence in Janice's life, didn't say much. She just visited more often, bringing meals, bringing wine, bringing her quiet companionship. They sat together in Janice's living room, watching the light shift across the floor as the day turned into night. It wasn't sadness that filled the room. It was something different, something deeper. The understanding that time, though fleeting, was still hers to spend in her own way. Janice recorded voice messages for Callie to listen to later. Her voice, once filled with uncertainty and restraint, was now clear and strong, offering advice that had taken a lifetime to learn. Callie, she began in the first message, the words flowing with an ease that surprised her. You'll face challenges. There will be moments when you feel like you can't go on, but you can. Always remember that you are the sum of all the people who've loved you, not just the ones who've hurt you. The messages kept coming, each one filled with wisdom, memories, and love. She spoke of life, of the city she had helped build, of the quiet joy of a morning walk in the sun, of the importance of standing firm, of taking up space in a world that constantly tried to erase people like her. She wanted Callie to know that her life had meant something, that she had been seen. Don't shrink for anyone, Callie, she said in another message, her voice stronger now. The world will always try to make you smaller. Don't let it. Take up all the space you need. The messages were long, full of the love and wisdom Janice had quietly gathered over the years. When she finished, she sat back, the weight of it all settling in her chest. These would be her legacy, not money, not property, but her voice, her life, passed down in the quietest way, for Callie to hear, to understand, when she needed it most. The obituary she wrote for herself came soon after. It was short, simple, dignified. It wasn't filled with accolades or achievements. It was filled with truth. She took up space and left it better. Janice smiled as she read the words over and over. They were true. She had lived a life that mattered, even if it had never been fully recognized by the people who should have known her best. The ones who had erased her, minimized her, but she had mattered to Callie, to Gloria, to the city that had once been her canvas, and that was enough. In the weeks that followed, Gloria visited daily, as though knowing something was shifting. She helped Janice sort through the last remnants of her life, the little things that had been left behind in the wake of her transition. Photographs, old journals, letters from a life that no longer seemed to fit. Together, they sorted through it all, sometimes talking, sometimes sitting in silence. Janice had never needed much, just the people who saw her, who understood. And now, in her last chapters, she was finally able to be who she had always been, without apology. As the days passed, the air in her small apartment grew lighter. She could feel it, the space she had carved for herself, the place where she no longer needed to hide. The quiet strength in her was finally free to breathe, and nothing, not even the shadows of the past, could take that away. Janice sat in the quiet of her living room, the soft hum of the city drifting through the open window. The afternoon sun painted the walls in golden light, and for a moment, everything felt as it should, peaceful. Then her phone buzzed, a text message from Callie. Janice's fingers hesitated before she tapped the screen. "Grandma, I don't know what to say, but you didn't just forget her. You deleted her." Janice stared at the words, Callie's words. The weight of them sunk deep into her chest, but there was no anger in them. Only the truth, plain and clear. Janice had done what she had to do, but hearing it from Callie, her granddaughter, the one who had seen her all along, brought everything into sharp focus. She hadn't just walked away, she had erased Melanie from her life completely. As if to say that none of it had ever mattered. She read it again. The weight of the words hit differently. There was no regret in Callie's voice, only the painful acknowledgement of what Janice had done, and why. A small sigh escaped her lips. She set the phone down, sipping her tea, letting the quiet fill the space between her and the screen. She didn't reply right away. What could she say? Callie was right. But was it wrong? Melanie had erased her first. She'd tried to push Janice out of her own life, turning her into a nuisance, into something disposable. What else was Janice supposed to do? Shrink into the shadows, keep herself small and quiet to make room for Melanie's brand? No. She had made her choice, and there was no going back. Another buzz, another message, this time from Melanie herself. "She's being dramatic," Melanie wrote. "You can't just erase the past like that. It's not healthy." Janice stared at the message for a long time, each word a reminder of how far apart they had drifted. Melanie, as always, couldn't see the bigger picture. She couldn't understand why Janice had done what she had done. All she saw was a daughter she couldn't control anymore. And then a third message came. This one from Trevor. "She's being done." Janice read Trevor's words slowly, her heart heavy. Trevor had never been able to stand up to Melanie, not in any meaningful way. And now it seemed he had chosen his side. But this was nothing new. His words, his silence, it was all part of the story they had been writing for years, one that had never truly included Janice. With a deep breath, Janice set the phone down, not bothering to reply. She didn't need to. The truth was already out there, unspoken. Melanie would never understand. Neither would Trevor. Callie had seen it, but no one else ever would. Janice sat back in her chair, the weight of it all pressing down on her for just a moment longer. The woman who had given everything to her daughter had been replaced by someone who didn't even recognize her anymore. It didn't matter. It never would again. In the days that followed, Janice found herself in the park, standing in front of a bench she had donated. It was new, still polished from the workers who had placed it there. The plaque was simple, engraved with a single line, "Reserved for those who made room for others." Janice smiled softly to herself as she read the words again. It felt right. She had made room for herself, room to breathe, to stand tall, to live her truth. It wasn't just for her. It was for the people who understood what it meant to make space for others. People like Callie, people like Gloria, people who had never tried to erase her. She sat on the bench, feeling the cool of the metal against her skin. The city was busy around her, people walking, laughing, going about their day. But Janice felt a quiet peace in the center of it all, the stillness inside her stronger than any noise around her. A few days later, Richard called her, his voice calm as always. "Janice," he said, "I finished the final clause for the trust." Janice listened, nodding even though he couldn't see her. "What is it?" she asked. "No use of your name or image in any publication or product," Richard said. "Not for promotional purposes, not for anything. I've made sure it's all in there." Janice closed her eyes for a moment, feeling a deep sense of finality settle over her. It was done. Her name, her image, her legacy, none of it would be used to build anyone else's story. It would be hers alone, the way it should have always been. She hung up the phone and looked out the window, the city lights beginning to twinkle in the distance. Tomorrow would come, And she would face it. She would face whatever was left of the life she had built, with her own hands and no one else's interference. Her life was finally her own, and nothing, not even the past, could take that away. The cease and desist arrived quietly, as expected. Richard had crafted the letter with his usual precision. It was simple, direct. Please remove all unauthorized use of my client's name and likeness. It wasn't a request. It was a statement. Melanie's carefully constructed image, built on lies and manipulation, was about to fall apart. Janice felt something settle in her chest as she read the letter. It wasn't triumph she felt, but something quieter. The finality of it. It was done. The truth was on paper now, protected in ink. And yet she still couldn't shake the feeling that something had been lost. Or maybe that something was finally being set free. A few hours later, Janice watched Melanie's public account go private. The photos disappeared from the spotlight, slipping into the dark corners of the internet. The perfect facade of a daughter who could do no wrong. A mother who'd given everything, now locked behind a screen. The narrative was hers, not Melanie's. Janice smiled, but the smile didn't feel like victory. It felt like nothing. The victory was in the silence, in the absence of words, not in the sound of victory. Without hesitation, she went through her phone and found the last photo of Melanie, the one they'd taken on the porch so many years ago. The one where their smiles were real, or at least seemed to be. She stared at it for a long time, and without a single word, she deleted it. Closure isn't always a conversation. Sometimes it's just a locked door. The words came to her like they always did, simple and true. She had no need to explain, no need to speak. She had already said everything she needed to say, and Melanie, and Trevor, and everyone who had failed to see her, would never understand, and that was fine. Janice had learned to be comfortable with it. Callie came by more often now, bringing dinner or simply spending time with Janice. There were days when they didn't need to talk at all. They would sit together, just existing, while the world spun around them. One evening, Callie handed her a scrapbook. "I put it together," she said, sitting beside Janice on the couch. The album was filled with old photos, the ones Janice had kept tucked away, the ones that hadn't been erased by time or by Melanie's reimagined version of their history. Janice flipped through it slowly. The memories of a life lived with purpose. She smiled at each page, seeing her past laid out in front of her, and yet it felt like a new life altogether. As if she were seeing it for the first time. "There's a picture missing," Janice said quietly, her fingers hovering over an empty space in the album. "Which one?" Callie asked. "The last one we ever took. You and me," Janice replied. Callie's eyes softened, but she didn't say anything. Instead, they began adding to the album, creating new memories together. Memories that would never be rewritten, never erased. A few days later, Gloria came by, a bottle of wine in hand, her steady presence comforting as always. They didn't need to talk much. The silence between them had become its own language, one they both understood. Gloria sat beside Janice and Callie, and they let the evening stretch on, the light outside dimming into night. Janice didn't feel the need to say anything. There was nothing left to say. The decisions had been made. The past had been sealed away, and the future was hers to create. As Gloria snapped a photo of them laughing together in the last light of the day, Janice felt the weight of it all fall away. This was her truth now. Not the past, not the way others tried to define her, but the quiet strength she had finally embraced. She was no longer the mother who had been erased, or the woman who had been forgotten. She was Janice, and that was enough. A week later, Janice sat with Richard, signing the final medical directive. It was simple, clear. Let no one speak for me but me. It was her last request, a small but significant act of reclaiming control. She smiled as she signed the paper, the finality of it settling deep into her bones. This was her life, her legacy. No one else would define it for her. As she stood up from the table, Richard's quiet voice reminded her, "You've done it, Janice. It's all in place." Janice nodded. She wasn't sure what came next, but for the first time in years, she felt like she could face it with peace. The obituary was brief. yet complete. Richard had handled it with the precision she had come to expect. It was simple, dignified, and true. Janice Abbott, 78, a retired city planner and advocate for affordable housing, passed away peacefully on date. Janice was a committed member of the Boulder Civic Preservation Trust, where her contributions helped preserve the city's historical architecture. She leaves behind her granddaughter, Callie Gray, and her lifelong friend, Gloria Denning. Her legacy continues through her work and the community she helped build. In lieu of flowers, donations may be made to the Boulder Civic Preservation Trust. There was no mention of Melanie, not a single word. The blank space where her name could have been was deafening. For Janice, it was the final, necessary act. Melanie had long ago made it clear she was not part of Janice's story anymore. Melanie's attempt to rewrite their history was rejected. She had submitted her own version of Janice's obituary, hoping to paint the past in the light of her own narrative. But it was swiftly turned away, with the paper citing factual discrepancies. Her words, carefully crafted, would never be the ones to tell Janice's story. Janice felt a small satisfaction in that. It wasn't about revenge, but about the quiet recognition that truth could no longer be obscured. The memorial, hosted by the Boulder Civic Preservation Trust, was a simple affair. Dozens attended, not as a tribute to a mother or daughter, but to a woman who had quietly shaped her community. There were no grand speeches, no dramatic goodbyes, just a collection of memories, photos, and the people who had worked beside Janice in life. When Callie stood to speak, her voice cracked slightly, but it was strong. She never needed a spotlight, Callie said, glancing around the room. Just a place to sit, a place where she could be seen for who she truly was. And she made sure that others, too, had a place to be seen. There was no fanfare, no applause. The truth of Janice's life was in the quiet recognition of the people who understood. The people who had seen her when no one else had. At the back of the room, Melanie stood, uninvited. She looked around, but no one approached her. No one greeted her. She left quietly, unnoticed. Callie didn't watch her go. She didn't need to. Janice's life had been her own, and that truth stood stronger than any attempt to rewrite it. The room was still when Richard began to read Janice's final will. It was a quiet occasion, much like the rest of her life had been. Unceremonious, devoid of fanfare, and undeniably final. Janice had arranged it all meticulously. No drama, no theatrics, just the truth. Her wishes. Everything, Richard read aloud, his voice steady, is left to Callie Gray for the purpose of continuing the work Janice Abbott believed in. The Boulder Civic Preservation Trust is named as a recipient for the preservation of historical architecture and affordable housing. Her personal effects, including those with significant sentimental value, are to be divided between Gloria Denning and Callie. Janice had always been clear in her priorities. Callie, her granddaughter, who had always seen her, was the centerpiece of this life's work. Gloria, her steadfast companion, would hold the memories. And the cause they had both championed would continue, untouched by the past that had so desperately tried to erase Janice. The final part came next, the part that would ring in the silence. No mention of Melanie Abbott Gray is to be made. She is not included in the distribution of assets, nor is she to have access to any part of this estate. A weight settled over the room as Richard paused. Melanie's absence from the document was not accidental, nor was it a petty exclusion. It was deliberate, the result of years of erasure, of hurt, of Janice no longer being able to live in the shadows of a daughter who had seen her as disposable. And it was Janice's final, undeniable statement. Melanie didn't speak, but her face twisted with disbelief as Richard continued. Her eyes flickered toward Trevor, who said nothing at all. He simply stood, his face a mask of discomfort. Slowly, he turned and walked out of the room, not bothering to make any excuses. There would be no reconciliation, no confrontation, just the end of a relationship that had always been strained, always half-formed, like a story someone had stopped telling halfway through. Melanie, as always, wasn't ready to let go. "Is this legal?" she asked, her voice cold and thin, like she was trying to claw back some power from the situation. Richard's response was clipped and professional, very and permanent. The silence between them stretched, thick and unyielding. There was no question of whether Melanie could challenge it. The will had been finalized, sealed, and protected with all the legal care Richard could offer. There was no way forward for her, only the cold truth of Janice's final decision. Later, Callie sat in Janice's apartment, a single sealed envelope in front of her. She hadn't opened it yet, waiting for the right moment. Her hands trembled slightly as she broke the seal. The letter inside simple but profound. To the ones who made room, it began. There were no accusations, no bitterness, only gratitude. You gave me space when the world tried to shrink me. You stood by me when others turned away. You understood what no one else could. You allowed me to breathe. And then, Janice's final gift, recipes. Her handwriting neat and clear, detailing her favorite dishes, the ones she had cooked and served through the years, meals shared with Callie, with Gloria, with the people who had truly mattered. You'll find joy in these, the letter continued. Food is a way to share love. Don't forget to share it. Callie smiled, a soft tear slipping down her cheek. This was Janice's way. No grand gestures, no final speeches, just quiet, steadfast love. The letter wasn't a goodbye. It was an invitation to continue, to remember, and to build from the foundation she had left. She folded the letter carefully and placed it back in the envelope, her heart swelling with the realization of what she had gained and what had been lost. Janice's apartment, once a quiet haven, became something more, a space for others to create. The Boulder Arts Council had approached Callie with the idea: transform the space into an artist-in-residence suite for young women, a place where new voices could find their own quiet strength. It was exactly what Janice had wanted. A space where others could build their own legacies without the need for applause, where their work could be nurtured in the way hers had never been. Callie took over the Preservation Trust and soon began curating Janice's journals into a local archive. The handwritten notes, the maps of old buildings, the plans for spaces that never came to life. All of it was now part of Boulder's history. As Callie carefully organized the papers, she felt the weight of her grandmother's legacy fall into place. She saw it for the first time, how Janice's quiet contributions had shaped the city around them. Every blueprint, every map, every record now told the story of a woman who had worked tirelessly in the background, leaving a city better than she had found it. It wasn't loud or flashy, but it was steady, and it was real. Meanwhile, Melanie tried and failed to capitalize on the narrative of family she had worked so hard to cultivate. She launched a podcast called Family Boundaries, promising wisdom and insight about personal growth and healing. But the podcast faltered after a few months, the numbers too low, the content too empty. People weren't interested in her brand of advice when they knew how hollow the foundations were. Melanie's carefully built empire crumbled, not with a bang, but with a whimper, another project left behind, like so many others, as fleeting as the stories she had tried to rewrite. Callie didn't have the same need for public recognition. She didn't need the world to know the truth about her grandmother. She just needed to carry it forward in her own way. Every year on Janice's birthday, Callie would visit the bench in the park. It was small, simple, and unobtrusive, just a bench for anyone who needed it. The plaque was barely noticed, but it meant the world to her. It read, "She sat. She saw. She stayed true. She would leave flowers, never too many, just enough." Then, she would sit quietly for a few minutes, remembering the woman who had shaped her life without saying a word. It wasn't about grand gestures. It was about standing firm, quietly, in the face of everything that had tried to erase Janice. The city, in its own way, began to take notice. The Boulder Historical Museum announced a Janice Abbott Day. It wasn't a celebration filled with fanfare or awards. There were no speeches, no cameras, no performances. It was a quiet gathering, a reflection on how one person's small, steady influence had changed the city. The people who came understood. They remembered. Janice's legacy wasn't built on the spotlight. It was built in the quiet moments, in the work that continued even after she was gone. And as Callie stood there in the museum that day, she thought of Janice. She thought of the woman who had lived a life so deeply grounded in truth that it could never be taken away, no matter how much the world tried to forget. Janice's name, once relegated to the background, was now being written into the history of the city she had loved. No one could erase it anymore. No one would ever forget. Janice had always known that she wouldn't leave behind a legacy of grandiosity. She didn't need the world to see her. She just needed to make sure the world didn't forget who she had been. Her daughter had said she was taking up space in her home, so Janice made sure Melanie didn't take up a single line in her estate. Janice had taken up space in her own way, and the world, her world, would remember her for it.